In the late 1930s, the city of Lviv, then known internationally as Lviv, occupied a complex and contested position within Eastern Europe. Situated in southeastern Poland, it was the third largest city of the Polish Republic, with a population approaching 34,000. Its demographic composition reflected centuries of shifting borders. Roughly 50% of inhabitants were Poles, about 30% Jews, and approximately 15% Ukrainians, with smaller German and Armenian minorities. Each community maintained its own institutions, cultural life, and political organizations, yet all were bound together by the city's role as a regional hub of administration, trade, and education. Universities, theaters, and press outlets thrived, while at the same time tensions persisted over language rights, political representation, and economic disparities. The wider geopolitical context shaped these local dynamics in decisive ways. Following the end of the First World War, Lviv became part of the newly re-established Polish state after the Polish-Ukrainian War of 1918 to 1919, while Poles celebrated the city's incorporation as a symbol of regained sovereignty. Many Ukrainians viewed it as the loss of a historic center of their culture and aspirations. The interwar decades saw a Polish state intent on consolidating control over its eastern borderlands, known as the Kresy, while Ukrainian activists, both moderate and radical, sought varying degrees of autonomy or independence. This political landscape was further complicated by the Jewish community, which formed an essential part of Lviv's economic and cultural life, yet faced restrictions, anti-Semitism, and competition over resources. Internationally, the balance of power in Eastern Europe was fragile. Poland sought security through alliances with France and the United Kingdom, but remained geographically vulnerable between Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. In 1938, the Munich Agreement and the subsequent dismemberment of Czechoslovakia demonstrated the weakness of collective security in the region. The following year, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on the 23rd August 1939, fundamentally altered the strategic environment. Secret protocols of the pact divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, with the eastern part of Poland, including Lviv, designated for Soviet occupation. As Germany invaded Poland on 1 September 1939 with more than 1.5 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, the Polish army attempted to resist, with about 1 million soldiers mobilized, though many units remained under-equipped. Lviv became a focal point of military operations by mid-September. German units from the 14th Army, advancing from the west and southwest, pushed into Galicia. Luftwaffe bombings struck Lviv on 12 and 13 September, damaging infrastructure and causing civilian casualties. Polish defenders, including regular army formations and hastily organized volunteers, prepared the city for siege. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union entered the conflict, launching its own invasion of eastern Poland with approximately 500,000 troops. The Red Army advanced rapidly across the border, encountering limited organized resistance as the Polish command, already strained by fighting Germany, had not prepared for a two-front war. For Lviv, this development altered the strategic calculation entirely. The city, initially threatened by German forces, now faced encirclement from two sides. Soviet units of the 6th Army, moving westward, approached the outskirts of Lviv by 19th September. After brief negotiations and limited skirmishes, Polish commanders surrendered the city to the Red Army on 22nd September, bypassing a direct confrontation with German troops who had also been approaching. The transfer followed the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with Germans withdrawing and handing over positions to Soviet forces. For the population of Lviv, the events of September 1939 marked the beginning of a profound transformation. The collapse of the Polish state, the sudden replacement of German by Soviet troops, and the uncertain political future generated an atmosphere of fear and instability. Some Ukrainians initially greeted the Red Army with hopes for cultural recognition and relief from Polish dominance, while many Poles experienced the occupation as the loss of sovereignty and the dismantling of institutions central to their identity. The Jewish community, caught between rival powers, navigated the situation cautiously, aware of both potential threats and possibilities under the new regime. Thus, within a span of only 3 weeks, Lviv shifted from being a major city of the Polish Republic to a frontier outpost of the Soviet Union, foreshadowing the turbulent years that lay ahead. The Soviet takeover of Lviv in September 1939 introduced a new political and administrative order that reshaped daily life. Immediately after the Red Army's entry, Soviet authorities began dismantling Polish institutions, replacing them with organs of Soviet power. The city, now incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was declared the capital of the newly established Lviv Oblast. Local government, schools, press, and cultural organizations were rapidly Sovietized, as Moscow sought to integrate the annexed territories into its political system. Streets and public spaces were renamed, Soviet symbols replaced Polish emblems, and portraits of Stalin and other leaders became fixtures in schools and offices. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, played a central role in consolidating control. Polish officials, military officers, and members of the intelligentsia were identified as potential threats. Arrests began within days of the occupation, targeting political activists, clergy, and anyone suspected of loyalty to the former Polish state. Thousands of residents were deported eastward to labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan during successive waves of deportations between 1940 and 1941. Estimates suggest that across western Ukraine, more than 300,000 people were deported, with a significant proportion coming from Lviv and its surroundings. Families were often separated, and those transported faced harsh conditions, including inadequate shelter, food shortages, and forced labor. The impact of Soviet rule differed across communities. For many Poles, the occupation meant the abrupt end of their privileged status in administration, education, and the military. Universities were restructured, Polish professors and teachers were dismissed or arrested, while instruction was reorganized along Soviet ideological lines. Ukrainian language education and cultural expression, restricted under Polish rule, were initially expanded, though always under strict Soviet oversight. Ukrainian political activists, however, quickly discovered that independence movements or expressions of nationalism were not tolerated, and members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were arrested and executed. For the Jewish population, Soviet policies eliminated the overt anti-Semitism of the interwar Polish state, but brought new restrictions. Religious and community institutions were closed, Zionist and other political organizations banned, and private businesses nationalized, affecting many Jewish merchants and professionals. Economically, the integration into the Soviet system disrupted existing networks. Private property was confiscated, banks and industries nationalized, and trade reoriented toward the Soviet interior. Shops faced shortages as the centrally planned economy replaced market mechanisms. While some workers benefited from expanded employment in state enterprises, the sudden transition generated dislocation and resentment among those who lost livelihoods. Rural areas experienced collectivization campaigns, with farmers compelled to join collective farms, often against their will, leading to tensions and sporadic resistance. Cultural life was likewise transformed. Soviet authorities promoted literature, theater, and art aligned with socialist realism, celebrating workers, peasants, and Red Army soldiers. At the same time, they suppressed independent journals, newspapers, and religious publications. Lviv's once diverse intellectual environment narrowed under censorship, and many writers, scholars, and journalists either fled, were arrested, or adapted their work to new ideological demands. Churches and synagogues remained under surveillance, with clergy facing harassment and restrictions on religious activities. The wider population reacted in varied ways. Some Ukrainians viewed the Soviet presence as an opportunity for social advancement and access to higher education, which had been restricted under Polish rule. Jews, while wary of Soviet repression, initially welcomed relief from Polish anti-Semitism and German occupation. Yet enthusiasm soon faded as arbitrary arrests, censorship, and deportations spread fear across all communities. the promise of equality under socialism was overshadowed by the reality of political repression and the elimination of independent civic life. By mid-1941, Soviet control over Lviv was firmly established in institutional terms, but the city remained unsettled. The annexation had not resolved national tensions. It had instead layered them with the machinery of a totalitarian regime. As Europe plunged deeper into war, the fate of Lviv once again stood on the edge of upheaval, with its population caught between rival empires whose confrontation loomed ever closer. The outbreak of war between Germany and the Soviet Union in June 1941 transformed the strategic significance of Lviv once more. Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22nd of June with more than 3 million Axis soldiers, marked the largest invasion in history. Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with advancing through Ukraine toward Kiev and beyond, and Lviv lay directly in the path of this offensive. The German command viewed the city not only as a military target, but also as a critical logistical hub, with railways linking Central Europe to the Black Sea, and supply routes stretching toward the Soviet interior. The Soviet military presence in western Ukraine was substantial. The Red Army's southwestern front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, fielded more than 6,000 troops across the region, organized into multiple armies including the 6th, 12th, and 26th. Around Lviv, elements of the 6th Army and supporting mechanized corps were responsible for defending key positions. The Red Army had considerable numbers on paper, tens of thousands of infantry, several hundred tanks, and artillery units, but in practice suffered from severe shortages of modern equipment, poor coordination, and a lack of preparedness for a sudden German assault. Many units had only recently been moved westward after the 1939 annexations and were unfamiliar with the terrain or inadequately supplied. For the German Wehrmacht, the primary spearheads were the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist and the 17th Army under General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel. These forces combined mechanized speed with concentrated air support from Luftflotte 4, German armored divisions equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, as well as mechanized infantry, advanced rapidly into Soviet territory, overwhelming frontier defenses within the first days. Luftwaffe bombers struck Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground, while supply lines and rail junctions were heavily targeted to disrupt Soviet mobility. The civilian population of Lviv, numbering about 35,000 by 1941, found itself in a state of uncertainty and fear as fighting approached. Memories of the Soviet occupation were fresh, marked by arrests, deportations, and the suppression of political freedoms. Many Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews had developed their own expectations about what the German advance might bring. Some Ukrainian nationalist groups, particularly those aligned with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, saw the German invasion as a possible opportunity to establish an independent state. Poles, still loyal to the idea of a restored Polish Republic, regarded both occupying powers with suspicion. For Jews, the German approach carried ominous implications, given reports filtering in about anti-Semitic policies in occupied Poland. The NKVD, anticipating the German advance, undertook drastic measures. In late June 1941, as Soviet forces began retreating, mass executions were carried out in Lviv's prisons to eliminate political prisoners before they could be liberated by advancing German troops. Thousands of detainees, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews alike, were killed in a matter of days. These executions left a lasting trauma in the city, as relatives discovered the bodies after the Soviets withdrew. The event also fueled hostility towards Soviet rule, reinforcing local resentments built up since 1939. By 29th of June, German armored units were approaching Lviv. The Red Army attempted counterattacks using mechanized corps, including formations equipped with T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks, some of the most advanced designs of the era. In several engagements, these Soviet tanks proved formidable against German armor. However, poor communication, lack of fuel and ammunition, and inadequate coordination led to the collapse of these counteroffensives. German tactics of encirclement, combined with superior air support, gradually forced Soviet defenders to retreat. On 30th June 1941, German troops entered Lviv. Soviet forces withdrew eastward, leaving behind devastated infrastructure and abandoned equipment. The rapid fall of the city reflected both the effectiveness of German operational planning and the systemic weaknesses of Soviet forces in the early stages of Barbarossa. For Lviv's inhabitants, the transition from Soviet to German occupation occurred with astonishing speed, once again altering the structures of authority, security, and daily survival. Within hours of the German entry, new proclamations were issued, nationalist banners appeared, and local political groups attempted to seize the moment amid the chaos of collapsing Soviet power. What followed would determine the fate of the city's diverse communities under a new and brutal occupation regime. The German occupation of Lviv in late June 1941 introduced a radically different order, one defined by military administration, ideological objectives, and the immediate reshaping of political and social life. The city was placed under the control of German military authorities, later incorporated into the general government, and, by autumn, administered as part of the district of Galicia within the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. German forces entered Lviv, accompanied by Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS and police units tasked with security, intelligence gathering, and the elimination of perceived enemies of the Reich. Their presence signaled that this occupation would not be limited to military considerations, but would extend deeply into political and ethnic reorganization. The arrival of the Wehrmacht coincided with attempts by Ukrainian nationalists to assert independence. On 30th of June 1941, members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, aligned with Stepan Bandera's faction, proclaimed the restoration of Ukrainian statehood in Lviv. This declaration, made under German oversight but without Berlin's approval, reflected the belief among some Ukrainian leaders that collaboration might lead to recognition of independence. The Germans, however, had no intention of supporting sovereign structures. Within weeks, nationalist leaders were arrested or placed under restrictions, their proclamations suppressed, and the city's governance firmly placed under German authority. The first days of occupation were marked by violence. In the immediate aftermath of the Soviet retreat, the discovery of mass executions in local prisons fueled public outrage. Families searching for relatives uncovered thousands of corpses in NKVD facilities such as Brigidki and Zamierstyniv. German propaganda quickly exploited these killings, presenting them as evidence of Soviet brutality. Local hostility toward the Soviets was redirected against the city's Jewish population, whom Nazi propaganda accused of complicity with the Soviet regime. This narrative, combined with the presence of armed militias and the chaos of regime change, contributed to the eruption of pogroms in late June and early July. These pogroms resulted in the deaths of thousands of Jews, carried out by local mobs, auxiliary units, and with the encouragement or acquiescence of German forces. The occupation regime sought to reorganize civic life in line with German strategic needs. Administrative positions were filled with German officials, while Ukrainians were sometimes recruited into auxiliary police units, and Poles largely excluded from authority. The press was tightly controlled, with newspapers turned into instruments of propaganda, emphasizing German victories, anti-Semitic narratives, and anti-Soviet themes. Schools were reopened under strict supervision, teaching curricula adapted to German ideological standards, while higher education was drastically curtailed, with universities effectively closed to most locals. Cultural life was permitted only insofar as it served occupation objectives, while independent political activity was suppressed across all communities. Economically, Lviv's resources were redirected to support the German war effort. Industries were seized and integrated into the Reich's supply system. Factories were repurposed to produce goods for the military, while food requisitions placed heavy burdens on local farmers and urban populations. Shortages soon became widespread, with bread, meat, and essential goods rationed or available only through black markets. Forced labor policies were introduced, with thousands of Lviv residents, including Jews and Poles, conscripted for construction projects, infrastructure repair, and eventually deported to labor camps in Germany and occupied territories. For Jews, the occupation introduced escalating restrictions. Already in July 1941, Jewish men were forced into labor brigades, compelled to clean streets, repair infrastructure, and clear the aftermath of battles. Public humiliations, confiscation of property, and the imposition of discriminatory laws quickly followed. Jewish businesses were expropriated, and movement within the city was restricted. By late 1941, preparations for the creation of a ghetto began, part of the systematic segregation and eventual destruction of the Jewish community. The once vibrant Jewish presence in Lviv, which had numbered around 1,000 before the war, was being rapidly dismantled under the occupation framework. At the same time, Poles faced their own set of restrictions. As representatives of the defeated Polish state, they were denied political rights, their schools and institutions curtailed, and cultural life forced underground. Many were conscripted into forced labor, while Polish clergy and intellectuals were closely monitored. The German authorities regarded both Poles and Ukrainians as populations to be managed and exploited, rather than partners in governance, though they skillfully manipulated existing tensions between communities to maintain control. By the end of 1941, Lviv had undergone yet another transformation of rule. The transition from Soviet to German control reshaped the city's demographic and political balance, exacerbating divisions and introducing new mechanisms of terror. For the city's inhabitants, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and others, the rapid succession of occupations meant that survival required constant adaptation to shifting authorities. Under German control, however, the stakes were elevated further, as ideological objectives, racial policies, and the logic of total war converged upon Lviv, placing its diverse communities under relentless pressure and unprecedented threat. The consolidation of German power in Lviv during late 1941 and early 1942 was accompanied by systematic measures aimed at the control, segregation, and eventual destruction of the city's Jewish population. German policies followed a clear sequence: the initial imposition of restrictions, the forced creation of ghettos, and the organization of mass deportations. These steps were part of broader occupation strategies across Eastern Europe, but in Lviv, they unfolded with distinctive intensity, given the city's large Jewish community and its location at the crossroads of military operations and administrative structures. From autumn 1941, Jews were subjected to strict identification measures. They were ordered to wear armbands with the Star of David, and curfews restricted their movements. Property seizures accelerated, with confiscation of valuables, businesses, and homes. Employment opportunities were confined to forced labor brigades, which carried out tasks ranging from construction and road work to cleaning military facilities. These policies not only marginalized Jews economically, but also publicly marked them as a segregated group, increasingly isolated from the rest of the city's inhabitants. In November 1941, the German administration announced the establishment of a ghetto in the northern part of Lviv, centered around the Zamostyniv district. Approximately 12,000 Jews from the city and nearby villages were ordered to relocate there, often within days, under threat of execution. The ghetto was overcrowded from the outset. Families crammed into small apartments, sanitary conditions deteriorated, and food supplies were scarce. Disease spread rapidly, with outbreaks of typhus claiming thousands of lives. The ghetto's administration was overseen by a Judenrat, or Jewish council, which was compelled by German authorities to organize labor details, collect taxes, and distribute ration cards. While the Judenrat attempted to mitigate suffering, its existence placed Jewish leaders in an impossible position, forced to balance survival strategies with compliance to German orders. The German occupation relied heavily on auxiliary police units, including formations recruited from the local population. These units assisted in enforcing ghetto restrictions, rounding up Jews for labor assignments, and later facilitating deportations. Their presence underscored the layered nature of occupation power. The Wehrmacht and SS provided overarching command, while local collaborators ensured the daily implementation of policies. This structure enabled the occupiers to extend control with limited resources while simultaneously deepening divisions within the city. Mass deportations began in earnest in March 1942, when German authorities initiated operations to transfer Jews from the Lviv ghetto to extermination sites. The primary destination was the Bełżec death camp, located approximately 90 kilometers north of Lviv, which had been constructed as part of Operation Reinhard. During several deportation waves in 1942, tens of thousands of Jews were rounded up, transported in overcrowded trains, and systematically murdered upon arrival. German records and survivor testimonies indicate that by the end of that year, the majority of Lviv's pre-war Jewish population had been deported or killed. Those who remained faced continual terror as periodic actions reduced the ghetto population further through executions and selective deportations. For non-Jewish inhabitants of Lviv, these events were visible and undeniable. Deportations took place in broad daylight, with columns of Jews marched through the streets under armed guard, while some individuals attempted to provide assistance, hiding neighbors, smuggling food, or forging documents. Others exploited the situation, acquiring confiscated property or participating in denunciations. The occupation regime deliberately fostered divisions, portraying Jews as responsible for Soviet crimes and using their persecution to distract from broader exploitation of the city's resources. By late 1942, the ghetto had been transformed into a zone of near-total destruction. Remaining inhabitants were subjected to intensified forced labor, particularly in workshops producing goods for the German military. The conditions inside the ghetto deteriorated further, with starvation, disease, and executions steadily reducing the population. The process marked a decisive stage in the implementation of the final solution in Galicia, with Lviv serving as both an administrative center and a site of mass violence. The city, once home to one of the most significant Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, was being systematically emptied under occupation policy, altering its demographic and cultural fabric irreversibly. By early 1943, the German occupation of Lviv had entered a phase defined by intensified repression, deepening exploitation of resources, and the near-complete destruction of the city's Jewish community. The ghetto, already decimated by mass deportations in 1942, was systematically liquidated over the course of the following year. German authorities, with the assistance of auxiliary police units, conducted frequent actions that targeted those who had remained, dragging people from their homes, workplaces, and hiding places. By June 1943, the Lviv ghetto was officially dissolved. Survivors were transferred to the Annexation camp, located on the outskirts of the city, which functioned simultaneously as a labor, transit, and extermination site. The Annexation camp became central to the machinery of occupation in Lviv. Established in late 1941, it initially operated as a forced labor camp, supplying workers for German military enterprises and construction projects. Prisoners were compelled to work in workshops producing uniforms, equipment, and other supplies for the Wehrmacht. Over time, Janowska expanded into a site of systematic killing. Mass shootings occurred in the nearby Piaski Ravine, where thousands were executed. Deportations to Bełżec and other death camps continued until its closure, but the camp itself increasingly became a locus of extermination. Conditions were catastrophic. Overcrowding, starvation, brutal treatment, and epidemics claimed countless lives. By late 1943, it is estimated that tens of thousands of Jews passed through Janowska, the majority perishing either there or in associated killing actions. Beyond the Jewish tragedy, the occupation pressed heavily on the city's broader population. The German administration, now firmly institutionalized under the general government's district of Galicia, pursued a strategy of maximum resource extraction. Agricultural requisitions deprived local farmers of grain, livestock, and supplies, causing shortages in both rural and urban areas. Food rationing left city dwellers with meager allocations, forcing many to rely on illegal markets. Industrial production, limited though it was by wartime conditions, was directed almost entirely toward supporting the German war effort. Factories were placed under German management, with Poles and Ukrainians conscripted as laborers. Increasingly, younger residents were deported to the Reich as part of the forced labor program, swelling the ranks of millions working in German industries far from home. The political environment remained tightly controlled. Ukrainian aspirations for autonomy had been definitively rejected by German authorities, and nationalist movements were split in their responses. Some Ukrainians served in German auxiliary police or administrative roles, seeking influence within the occupation structure, while others shifted toward underground resistance. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its armed wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, grew in strength by 1943, launching attacks not only against German forces but also against Soviet partisans and, in the wider region, engaging in violent campaigns against Polish civilians. In Lviv itself, however, direct UPA activity was limited, as the city remained firmly in German hands. For Poles, the occupation continued a pattern of suppression and marginalization. Polish schools operated only at the elementary level, and cultural institutions were curtailed or driven underground. Many members of the Polish intelligentsia were imprisoned or executed. The Polish resistance, linked to the underground Armia Krajowa, maintained networks within Lviv, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and clandestine education. Their activities remained dangerous, as the Gestapo's surveillance and repression were constant. Arrests, deportations, and executions kept the threat of German retaliation ever present. By late 1943 and into 1944, the military situation shifted decisively against Germany. Soviet victories at Stalingrad and Kursk had transformed the strategic balance, and the Red Army began advancing steadily westward. Lviv, located on key transportation routes, assumed renewed military importance. German authorities strengthened defensive positions around the city and intensified repression to maintain order as the front approached. Forced labor demands increased, while deportations and executions accelerated in an attempt to eliminate any remaining groups deemed hostile or expendable. Within the city, the social fabric had been irrevocably altered. The Jewish community, once numbering over 1,000, had been virtually annihilated. Polish and Ukrainian populations lived under constant fear, subject to arbitrary violence, economic exploitation, and political manipulation. The experience of occupation left enduring scars, embedding divisions and resentments that would resurface as Soviet forces prepared to retake the region. As 1944 approached, Lviv stood at the edge of yet another transformation, awaiting the return of the Red Army and the profound consequences it would bring for all of its inhabitants. As 1944 unfolded, the strategic situation around Lviv shifted dramatically. The German army, once in control of vast territories in the Soviet Union, was now in retreat on multiple fronts. The Red Army's counteroffensives had recaptured much of Ukraine, and by summer, the German position in Galicia was under direct threat. For Lviv, this meant renewed militarization of the city, intensified repression of civilians, and preparations for a major confrontation that would decide its immediate fate. The German authorities regarded Lviv as a critical stronghold due to its location on key east-west transport routes, rail lines connecting the Carpathians with central Ukraine, as well as supply roads running toward Krakow and Warsaw, converged in the city. In anticipation of a Soviet offensive, the Wehrmacht reinforced the region with elements of Army Group North Ukraine, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, later succeeded by Field Marshal Joseph Harp. Defensive positions were built around the city, trenches dug, and strong points prepared. German planners aimed to hold Lviv as long as possible to delay the Soviet advance into Central Europe. Within the city, occupation policies became harsher, as German forces struggled to maintain control. The Janovska camp continued to function into 1944, though its role shifted as deportations to extermination. Camps ceased following the closure of Bełżec in late 1942 and Treblinka and Sobibor in 1943. Janovska increasingly became a site of executions and forced labor. In November 1943, an attempted uprising by prisoners resulted in the escape of a small number, though the majority were killed. By the spring of 1944, mass shootings intensified, and as the front drew nearer, German units attempted to eliminate evidence of crimes by exhuming and burning bodies. For Poles and Ukrainians in Lviv, the approach of the Red Army introduced both hope and fear. The Polish underground, loyal to the government in exile in London, saw Soviet advances as an opportunity to reassert Polish claims over Lviv. The Home Army, Armia Krajowa, prepared clandestine structures to rise against the Germans when the Soviets arrived, in a plan similar to the Warsaw Uprising. However, its leadership also recognized the danger posed by Soviet domination, as earlier Soviet occupations in 1939-1941 had demonstrated hostility to Polish independence. Ukrainian nationalist movements faced their own dilemmas. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which had gained strength in the countryside, regarded both Germans and Soviets as enemies. While some Ukrainian formations had previously cooperated with the Germans, by 1944 many focused on resisting Soviet reoccupation, anticipating repression of Ukrainian nationalist aspirations. In Lviv, however, the presence of German forces limited overt UPA activity, forcing nationalist leaders to rely on underground networks. Civilians bore the brunt of escalating military and political pressures. Food shortages worsened as German authorities requisitioned supplies for retreating forces. Forced labor drafts intensified, with many residents deported to Germany to work in factories or on fortifications. Arrests of suspected resistance members, whether Polish, Ukrainian, or others, became routine. The Gestapo and Sicherheitspolizei maintained strict surveillance, attempting to crush underground activity before the front reached the city. The Soviet command prepared its offensive meticulously. By July 1944, the Red Army launched the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive, part of the wider summer campaign that included Operation Bagration further north. The First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, concentrated more than 1 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Against them, German Army Group North Ukraine deployed approximately 900,000 men, but many units were exhausted, under strength, and stretched across a broad front. The disparity in resources, combined with Soviet operational momentum, placed the Germans at a disadvantage. For Lviv's inhabitants, rumors and uncertainty circulated as the battle approached. Some anticipated liberation from German rule, others dreaded the return of Soviet power, recalling arrests, deportations, and executions from the earlier occupation. The Jewish survivors, few in number, faced the stark reality that the annihilation of their community had already been carried out, leaving them with little to hope for beyond survival. By mid-July 1944, artillery fire could be heard in the distance, signaling that the front had reached the city's outskirts. The final struggle for Lviv was about to begin, promising yet another transformation of authority and another test of endurance for its diverse and war-weary population. In July 1944, the decisive confrontation over Lviv erupted as part of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive, one of the largest Soviet operations of the summer campaign. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front initiated a coordinated assault against the German Army Group North Ukraine. The offensive began on 13th of July and rapidly gained momentum. Soviet forces committed approximately 1 million soldiers, supported by 2,050 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 16,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. Facing them, German forces numbered around 9,000 men, 900 tanks, and about 1,000 aircraft, but many units were depleted and lacked reserves. The German High Command sought to hold Lviv as a defensive anchor, to delay the Soviet advance into southern Poland and to protect retreat routes toward the Carpathians. Field Marshal Walter Model, a specialist in defensive operations, oversaw the sector. However, his ability to coordinate a coherent stand was undermined by Soviet breakthroughs on multiple fronts, stretching German formations thin. Soviet operational planning emphasized encirclement. While frontal attacks fixed German defenders in place, mobile armored groups were directed toward flanks and rear areas to cut off escape. The fighting around Lviv was marked by intensity and rapid maneuver. Soviet armored spearheads, supported by heavy artillery barrages, pressed westward, while infantry units secured key rail lines and river crossings. German forces attempted local counterattacks, often with armored formations, but shortages of fuel and ammunition limited their effectiveness. Luftwaffe units provided some resistance, striking Soviet columns, yet were unable to alter the strategic balance. By mid-July, German defensive lines east of Lviv had been penetrated, and Soviet forces began encircling the city. Inside Lviv, the German administration prepared for both defense and potential evacuation. Military headquarters requisitioned buildings, fortifications were strengthened, and supply dumps established. Civilians endured bombardments as Soviet artillery targeted railway yards, bridges, and troop concentrations. Urban life, already disrupted by years of occupation, now became dominated by the sounds of shellfire and the movement of columns of retreating German troops. For residents, daily survival required navigating curfews, shortages, and the constant risk of bombardment. The Polish underground, particularly the Armia Krajowa, initiated its own actions in mid-July 1944, timed to coincide with the Soviet advance. Known as the Lviv Uprising, it involved several thousand resistance fighters who launched attacks against German units within the city, capturing some positions and disrupting communications. Their aim was to liberate Lviv independently before Soviet troops arrived, thereby strengthening Polish claims to the city. For several days, heavy street fighting unfolded between German forces and Polish partisans, with Soviet units gradually closing in from the outskirts. On 27 July 1944, Soviet troops entered Lviv, supported by the Armia Krajowa fighters still holding parts of the city. The German garrison, unable to maintain its defenses, retreated westward, abandoning equipment and positions. The Red Army quickly secured control, and by the end of the month, the wider offensive had pushed German forces back toward the Vistula River, establishing bridgeheads in Poland. The liberation of Lviv was presented in Soviet accounts as a major triumph, highlighting the scale of the victory and the collapse of German defenses in Galicia. Yet for the population of Lviv, liberation brought mixed experiences. While German occupation had ended, memories of the Soviet rule between 1939 and 1941 resurfaced, generating widespread apprehension. Poles hoped their resistance efforts would ensure a role in post-war governance, while Ukrainians anticipated renewed struggles for national recognition. For the few surviving Jews, liberation meant escape from annihilation, though it also revealed the irreversible loss of their community. The battle for Lviv thus marked both an end and a beginning, the conclusion of German control and the re-establishment of Soviet authority, with all the consequences that entailed. The re-entry of the Red Army into Lviv in late July 1944 marked the beginning of a new phase in the city's wartime experience. Soviet power was reimposed almost immediately, with political, administrative, and security structures rapidly restored. NKVD units entered alongside frontline troops, tasked with re-establishing control, eliminating perceived enemies, and consolidating the city into the Soviet system. For many inhabitants, the return of Soviet authority was a moment of both relief from German occupation and dread at the revival of repressive mechanisms remembered from 1939 to 1941. One of the most immediate consequences involved the Polish underground. The Armia Krajowa, AK, which had taken an active role in the liberation of Lviv during the Lviv Uprising of July to 1944, expected recognition for its efforts. Soviet authorities, however, viewed the AK as a rival force loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. Within days of the city's capture, NKVD units arrested Polish commanders and began disarming resistance fighters. Many were deported to labor camps in the Soviet Union or imprisoned locally. This marked a decisive moment in the struggle over Lviv's political future, signaling that the Soviet Union intended to assert exclusive authority over the city and the wider region without accommodation for Polish claims. The Ukrainian population also faced renewed challenges. Ukrainian nationalist movements, embodied in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, had gained strength in rural areas during the German occupation. Their leaders understood that Soviet reoccupation meant suppression of Ukrainian aspirations for independence. In response, the UPA launched guerrilla warfare against Soviet forces and security organs, targeting convoys, communications, and officials. While less active inside Lviv itself, their presence in surrounding territories created an ongoing conflict that would continue for years after the war, marked by ambushes, reprisals, and large-scale security operations. The surviving Jewish community in Lviv emerged from the shadows into a city almost devoid of its former vibrancy. Of the pre-war population of more than 1,000 Jews, only a few thousand survived, some hidden by Polish or Ukrainian neighbors, others liberated from labor camps, and a handful who had joined partisan groups. The return of Soviet power offered survival, but not restoration. Synagogues and institutions destroyed during the occupation were not rebuilt, and survivors were dispersed or chose to emigrate in subsequent years. For them, liberation highlighted not only survival against extraordinary odds, but also the loss of family, community, and cultural life that had once defined Jewish Lviv. Economically, the Soviet Union quickly integrated the city into its wartime structure. Factories and workshops were placed under state administration, with production geared toward the Red Army's continuing campaigns. Rail lines were repaired to restore supply routes, essential for the Soviet advance into Poland and Central Europe. Housing shortages became acute, as wartime destruction combined with the influx of Soviet personnel and the displacement of populations. Food remained scarce, rationing persisted, and black markets continued as a survival mechanism. Politically, the re-establishment of Soviet rule involved the extension of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic's authority. Local councils were reorganized, propaganda emphasized the liberation of the city from fascism, and Soviet ceremonies reinforced loyalty to Moscow. Yet, beneath the rhetoric, repression resumed. Arrests targeted Poles associated with the underground, Ukrainians suspected of nationalist sympathies, and intellectuals or clergy regarded as potential opponents. Many families experienced deportations eastward, echoing the earlier waves of 1940, some 41. For Lviv civilians, the transition from German to Soviet rule represented continuity as much as change. Arbitrary arrests, political surveillance, and shortages replaced the terror of deportations and ghetto liquidation, but fear remained a constant feature of daily life. The city's multi-ethnic character had been shattered. Jews were almost entirely gone. Poles faced marginalization and eventual resettlement, and Ukrainians found their political aspirations suppressed. By late 1944, it was evident that Lviv was being reshaped not only by the outcomes of war, but also by the broader Soviet project of redefining borders, populations, and loyalties in Eastern Europe. The aftermath of the battle for Lviv thus carried immense consequences. The Soviet Union had secured a critical military and political position in Galicia, pushing the front westward while asserting dominance over contested territories. For the people of Lviv, however, it marked the start of another chapter of uncertainty, repression, and transformation, as the realities of post-war Soviet rule began to take hold. The reoccupation of Lviv by the Soviet Union in 1944 closed one chapter of the city's wartime ordeal, yet opened another defined by long-term political, demographic, and cultural consequences. What emerged was not a simple restoration of pre-war realities, but a profound reconfiguration of Lviv's identity, shaped by the destruction of its Jewish community, the displacement of its Polish population, and the imposition of Soviet rule. For the Jewish population, the legacy was one of near total annihilation. Before 1939, Lviv had been home to one of the largest and most dynamic Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, numbering over 1,000. By the war's end, fewer than 10% had survived. Synagogues, schools, newspapers, and theaters had been destroyed. Cemeteries desecrated, archives and libraries lost. Survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a city that had been emptied of its Jewish institutions. Some emigrated westward or to Palestine, while others remained, assimilating into Soviet life under restrictive conditions. The Holocaust in Lviv thus not only eliminated a community, but also severed centuries of cultural continuity, leaving a gap that reshaped the city's character permanently. The Polish presence in Lviv, which had dominated politics, education, and culture during the interwar years, also underwent dramatic change. The Soviet Union, determined to consolidate its western borders, implemented population transfers in coordination with the new communist Polish government. Between 1944 and 1946, the majority of Lviv's Polish inhabitants, estimated at more than 2,000, were resettled into territories annexed from Germany, including cities such as Wrocław and Gdansk. This relocation was often presented as voluntary, but in reality it was marked by pressure, coercion, and limited options. As a result, Lviv, long identified as a Polish cultural and academic center, ceased to function as such. Its institutions dismantled or transferred, and its legacy preserved largely in memory and émigré communities abroad. For Ukrainians, the return of Soviet power meant both consolidation and suppression. On one hand, Lviv was now fully integrated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, providing opportunities for advancement in administration, education, and culture under Soviet frameworks. Ukrainian language use expanded in public life, something previously restricted under Polish rule. On the other hand, the Soviet regime regarded independent Ukrainian nationalism as a direct threat. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army continued armed resistance in the countryside, engaging in clashes with Soviet security forces until the early 1950s. This conflict resulted in heavy casualties, mass arrests, and deportations of tens of thousands to Siberia and Central Asia. Lviv became a focal point of Soviet campaigns to suppress nationalist sentiment, leaving a deep imprint on local society. Economically and socially, post-war Lviv was reconstructed along Soviet lines. Industries were nationalized and reoriented toward the needs of the Soviet economy. The city's universities and academies were reorganized, bringing in new cadres of scholars and students from across the USSR, while purging individuals deemed politically unreliable. Architecture and urban planning reflected Soviet priorities, with new housing blocks, administrative buildings, and monuments altering the city's landscape. Yet beneath these changes, the pre-war multi-ethnic identity of Lviv had been replaced by a predominantly Ukrainian and Russian-speaking population, reshaped through war, deportation, and migration. The memory of the war years was also carefully managed. Soviet narratives emphasized the heroism of the Red Army and the liberation of Lviv from fascism, while downplaying or suppressing discussion of the Holocaust, Polish resistance, or Soviet repressions. Official commemorations highlighted victory, while silences surrounded the tragedies of deportations, mass executions, and the destruction of entire communities. This selective memory shaped how generations of Lviv's inhabitants understood their city's past. In the broader historical context, Lviv's wartime experience reflected the fate of Eastern Europe caught between two totalitarian powers. The city endured successive occupations, Polish, Soviet, German, and Soviet again, each leaving profound consequences for its population. Borders shifted, communities were uprooted, and the demographic and cultural fabric of the city was irreversibly altered. What had once been a multi-ethnic metropolis of Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Armenians, and others emerged from the war, transformed into a Soviet-Ukrainian city, its identity redefined by the political imperatives of the post-war order. The legacy of these years continues to shape Lviv's place in history. The destruction of its Jewish community remains a symbol of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. The displacement of its Polish inhabitants echoes in the memory of post-war population transfers. The suppression of Ukrainian nationalism and the imposition of Soviet power exemplify the broader story of Eastern Europe under Stalinist rule. Together, these layers of history illustrate the tragedy and resilience of a city that stood at the crossroads of empires, ideologies, and nations during one of the most turbulent periods of the 20th century.